think this is the strangest lecture I've ever given. How it arose was I was walking from the Science Museum with Doron, and he asked if I would like to say anything, to give a talk at this meeting. I said, well, I'm not really doing anything. I didn't want to rehash old things. And I said, I do have a germ of an idea, which has been sort of festering away for a while. So I said, give me 2 weeks to think about it, and I'll see if I think it's going to work. So anyway, it's for you to judge, not me, whether it works. The original idea I had was that I had just finished reading a book called The World War II in Colour. And there's quite a lot of books around. Another one is the London Underground in colour, and there's quite a lot of, it's a sort of a new historical genre. And it's been made possible by the advent of low-cost colour printing, which is essentially something that's happened since the 1990s. And when you look at those books, you see there is something quite different. I've taken an example here. On the left, there's a picture from the Coventry Blitz, which really ought to be quite poignant. And there's a picture on the right, a sort of more routine bombing from London. And yet the colour actually makes the one on the right, I think, have a much greater emotional impact than the one on the left. For me, it's the little canary in the cage, that bright yellow canary that you probably wouldn't see if this were not a colour illustration. So the other thing I found interesting in the book, and one of the books I read, was that it had quite a lot about the bombing of Stuttgart. Whereas normally we always talk about the bombing of Dresden. Why? Well, it was because there happened to be a colour photographer in Stuttgart and not in Dresden. And it's that simple happenstance that made you sort of take a different pathway through the history of the war. And I wanted to see if the same would happen if we actually focused on colour illustrations in the history of computing. Here's two rather standard illustrations. I've used them myself. Nothing wrong with them. They're very fine glass plate negative monochrome images. They are of Vannevar Bush, the inventor of the differential analyzer. One on the left, obviously a studio photograph, and the other one obviously taken by a professional photographer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, both pre-war. I've used these pictures, and I've seen them endlessly repeated, actually, and they're not spectacularly interesting. But if you look for some colour images, these are two that I find of the same subject. So the one on the left is a picture of Vannevar Bush again. And it made me think that every picture tells a story. It's a cliche. And yet, what that tells us is that we tend to think of Vannevar Bush as being sort of a boffin. But obviously it was actually quite well known, well enough known to appear on the cover of Popular Mechanics. The image on the right actually comes from a cigarette card. It's the only colour image that I know of the differential analyzer. And it comes from 1938, and it's from a series of cards called Modern Wonders. And it's a sort of a bunch of sort of many eccentric and now forgotten inventions, of which this is one. So again, it sort of shows that there was a sort of a popular conception for computing some time ago. I want to talk a bit, before I sort of get on to the meat of the lecture, talk about the kind of the sources of photographs. Photographs obviously is one of the major sources, either drawings or photographs. Colour photography doesn't really start until about the 1940s. Kodachrome was invented in 1935, to give you a date. So what you had then was toned photographs. You're probably very familiar with sepia toned photographs, which is actually a chemical process. And it's to sort of soften an otherwise rather harsh black and white image. But in fact, going back to the turn of the century, you could get tones in many different colours. This is a rather celebrated example. It's of Scott's Antarctic expedition. The blueness of it is quite compelling, I think. That image in black and white really doesn't carry anything like the same impact. Here's two in the history of computing. The one on the top is an IBM card program calculator, and it's been toned green for no good reasons I can think of. The one below is the Moore School of Engineering, where the modern computer was invented, sepia tone. Again, it simply softens the images and is, I think, more visually attractive than the black and white equivalent. Another source of photographs in colour are tinted photographs. This is a German example, and it shows it's actually of an American company. It's their general office. And you can see it's actually a sepia photograph, and then it's been tinted with about 4 different colours. And again, if you took the colours away from that, it's a much less striking image. We get to photography. These are both from the 1940s, when people start to Kodachrome and Kodachrome become popularly available. Still quite a rarity at that date, incidentally. These two are, I think, the only known colour photographs of John von Neumann, one of the co-inventors of the modern computer. Another source of images are colour film. Now, interestingly, colour film images are much more prevalent than they are in the 1930s than they are just routine colour photographs. For the reason, I think, that you could display colour film with no additional equipment. A projector doesn't mind what colour you use. On the other hand, photographs usually went into a print publication, and you could only do them in black and white, so there was no economic incentive to use black and white. Turning to printed sources, before photography, the only kind of illustration you get are engravings. And sometimes they're coloured and sometimes they're not. This encyclopedia, you probably can't read it there, but what it says actually is that that encyclopedia is 8 shillings per volume, but 10 and 6 if you have coloured engravings. And what would happen then, rather like there would be a set of girls would be employed to go through the encyclopedia and colour the images according to a chart, rather like the way you would colour pottery at the same time. So those images, the one on the towards the foot there, will be very familiar to mathematicians, showing the contrast between Arabic reckoning and using an abacus. The one on the right is interesting. It's the London Telegraph Office from about 1860. And again, you can see, I think, the visual impact of the colour there is quite extraordinary. The question is, an interesting one, do these colours actually have any meaning, or are they just imaginary? And I think the answer is that they're basically imaginary. I've got an example here of René Descartes. And this particular engraving is very widely reproduced, and I've seen it in many different colours. So the fact that he's wearing a red robe in one and a green in the other is completely immaterial. But nonetheless, I think the colour image does have a striking impact. When we get to colour printing, I think this is about the first example of colour printing in the mathematical domain, and actually one of the first colour books of any kind. It's what is now called spot colour, though I don't think there was no term for it at the time. It was simply colour printing. And what's going on there is that you have a letterpress book published in black ink, and then you overlay that with another impression with one of the colours, and then another one. So you have, in this case, 3 colours and black that are overlaid. You can imagine terrific problems with getting correct registration. And if you look at that carefully, you can see the registration is very good, but not quite perfect. And spot colour carries on right up to the present day. You quite often see it still. And the idea is that it simply jazzes up an otherwise rather dull-looking image. So the one on the left there is of Burroughs calculators. It's an interesting image because it actually shows a computing setup before the advent of the computer, when there's looks like 50 or 60 human computers in there. One on the right, again, an attempt to jazz up a monochrome image of a British tabulating machine. Again, 3 colours in that example, yellow, blue and red. You can just see the red there. So the next advancement are lithographic colour or chromolithography. And this is where you have a more modern looking technique where you would see that there is that the picture is made up of a screened image of little tiny dots. So the one on the left is the earliest example I found from 1904. In a huge volume. It's the single article that actually is done like this. Presumably it was sponsored by the person about whom it was being written. But the effect there, it's black and another colour, sort of a yellowy colour. It's quite striking, I think. Certainly within the context of that volume, it's very striking. One on the right, as we'll be talking about Babbage later, is an example of a Jacquard loom. Again, a very, very fine engraving. Actually, it's quite small. I mean, it's only about 5 inches, less than a postcard size, but a very crisp image. Anybody who's got a colour printer will be familiar that you have to have 3 colours in black: magenta, yellow, cyan. That's actually quite a recent development. That doesn't happen until the 1920s. So all colour prior to that. And it was a rare and expensive process, and it was usually done for art prints, for framing on people's walls. Would use a sort of a palette of colours. So this is one example where this particular printer has a standard palette of 12 colours. Other printers had, up to into the high 20s of different colours that would be used, and the image would be built up by progressively adding more and more layers of colour. There's a couple of examples here, actually, from the computing domain. The one on the left is a drawing. Sorry. Is a drawing. There was a fashion at one time for drawing very large examples of things. So this is a Dalton adding machine. Now, what's interesting about that is if you took a magnifying glass, for example, to the red there in Dalton, you would see it's pure red. It's not a mixture of yellow and magenta or some other colours. It's a pure colour. And on the right is an example where it's actually effectively a tinted postcard. So it's a black and white image that has then been superimposed with different layers of colour. This example actually comes from 1920, and it's the beginning of the 3-colour process. So how this is now done is that you photograph the image and separate the image into yellow, magenta and cyan, and then when you overprint them with careful registration, you generate the full colour, which is in the bottom of those 4 images on the left. You actually get a much better effect if you also have black in addition to those colours. So the example on the right from 1950 is a 4-colour example. And the black sort of produces much better depth. This is an example of a duotone. Many of this sort of technique has more or less disappeared, but how that is done, it's actually the frontispiece of a book, the one on the left. And it's a black half-tone print, and then you add another colour, in this case a kind of sepia colour, slightly offset to it, and it produces a much greater sort of visual depth. You can see where it's been reproduced on the right and how flat that image looks. Actually, this comes from a book I wrote that was published in 1976, which I think was the low point of printing. It was using a film set technique. And the one on the right actually was a Japanese translation of the book, where they didn't actually rephotograph the images, but sort of took them from the book, so you get a further degradation again. So when you compare the right and left images on that thing, there's an extraordinary degradation. Everything today is printed by lithograph, which is the central image there. And in that technique, the ink is placed on the surface, usually of a rubber roller, and then that transfers to the paper. So it has very little adhesion to the paper, and that's why you probably noticed if you read the paper in bed, you get ink on the sheets. But your father probably didn't, because he was using letterpress, which is a raised or profile printing technology, and that then beds very deeply into the paper. The one on the right is a technique called gravure or intaglio. It's only really used in banknote printing today. And in that technique, you actually have a recess printing, so the ink sort of falls into little wells. And when it's printed, you get a much greater depth of colour. Very good. Anyone who's used the Children's Encyclopedia, I'm sure there must be people of that generation, will see those sort of brown and blue and green pages inside. That uses a technique called rotogravure, which is a high-speed version of it. But the image on the left, I think these are quite striking. One is from 1949 from the Illustrated London News. Really deep image. For example, you can, if you look carefully, you can actually see the pinstripe on Tom Kilburn's jacket, who's standing on the left. You can see all the texture of Freddie Williams' coat on the right. The other one on the right, again, from a perfectly good negative, but actually reproduced in 2012, and a manifestly less good photo. In fact, printing still has not completely got out of its nadir, I would say. Well, anyway, that was a little background on printing techniques. What I wanted to I said at the beginning that I want to see what sort of stories would emerge from doing this. And actually quite a lot of stories emerge, so I've picked two for today. So the first one is to talk about the origins of Remington Rand, which becomes one of the first, well, in fact, it is the first computer company, and along with IBM becomes one of the two major firms. So, and it's to talk really about database, what we would now call databases, but what they would have called file storage or some name like that. I think this is a most striking image. Obviously posed for the photographer for dramatic impact. So what you've got on the left is the correspondence department of the people who publish the Saturday Evening Post in the United States. So on the left there, you've got a row of people with dictating machines who are presumably responding to correspondence from their readers. And on the right, you've got a set of entirely female people who are using transcribing machines and typewriters to generate information. And if you look carefully on the left, you'll see that there are sets of filing cabinets there. So that's the repository where all this information goes. Because there's been a transformation in the way that business is conducted, sort of really from the 1890s onward, that people start to use typewriters, and that means that you now have loose sheets of paper all over the place, whereas once you would have recorded everything in a bound ledger. So that's why you need this storage technique. The vertical filing system is a major invention that we tend to overlook, invented 1892, I think. Usually made of wood in the early days, and progressively they become steel. And obviously still very common. One tends to forget what the advantage of these things. What they replace were drawers. So if you imagine trying to get all the paper, find a piece of paper in a drawer, it's much easier when it's stood on vertical on its edge. The other thing is it's very easy to expand the system because you just take a few files out and put them somewhere else. But it becomes very quickly commoditized, except for one important player, which is a man called James Rand, who finds the Rand company, which creates filing systems. So the standard filing cabinets, as you can see on the right there, somebody's taking the door off so as they can be sort of linked together. So this is from a 1908 example. And what you've got there are, on the left, it's something that would correspond to a hierarchical database in today's terms. So that there is in sort of the filing spectrum there a place for everything. So if you've got somebody called Mr. Brown, okay, then you'll be able to find a place in the Bs and a place in the BRs that you would be able to slot in. The one on the right would correspond to something that's much more like what we would call a relational database, because suppose you've got Mr. Brown and a Mrs. Smith, and they both happen to work for the same firm, then you would obviously want to put them in there. But how would you know? Well, the answer was that you had sort of an index on the top there. You've probably seen these, or people of an age will have seen these in libraries. So what you have at the bottom there are simply sort of really buckets, and they're just numbered. You can see they're just numbered, starting at 1 in that image. And you just, so that you would put Mr. Brown, say, and Mrs. Smith in number 5, and then that would be indicated by the index there, which tells you where they're located. I've simplified what's actually an incredibly complex system. It's sort of as complicated as trying to use a modern database in its way. It's full of detail. And of course, all these little plastic strips, celluloid strips at that time, were all expensive, and that was how Rand made the money. So here's some examples of filing systems. This is the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, which you see from, it says here, that the building, which is in New York, contains more elevators and typewriting machines than any building in the world. And it's that large white building, as you can see, next to the church. But insurance has a different problem, because correspondence is very variable. You can't, you carbon copies and all sorts of different things in there. With something like an insurance company, actually, you've got an extremely structured record. This is an example of what they call the ordinary department for ordinary insurance, middle-class insurance. And what they're using here are card index cabinets. So, because what you want to keep on the card index really is the name and address of the insured, and that their annual premium has been paid. So a very simple structure. And that shows you on the right there the kind of equipment that you could have bought for this. And it seems to be what they're using in that illustration. It's a very standard. And the Globe company was one of the big suppliers. These are some examples then of what you would have kept. You can see the filing columns. They're typically coloured, typically pre-printed, and you sort of enter them line at a time. Just a matter of interest, Metropolitan Life also has an industrial insurance business, just like the Prudential over the road. And they have something like 20 million customers at the date this card is produced, 1905. And this shows the filing system then. These are actually steel filing trays, each of which contains a card, one card per insured. So there's 20 million cards in that sort of run of rows there. So it's an enormous data processing task. Incidentally, it's growing very rapid. This is the Metropolitan Life. 5 years later, you can see that it's knocked down the church, built this enormous tower to the left. Well, of course, just to close the story, the Metropolitan has long since moved out to New York. It's in a business park somewhere in New Jersey. But that building still stands, and it's something of a New York landmark. Here's a much smaller example of a medium-sized insurance company. And you can see the two kinds of storage here. You've got, on the left hand of the image, you've got standard correspondence filing cabinets, and on the right you've got sort of index cards for that more structured information. The problem with index cards is what happens if one goes astray. Think of an insurance company and you lose the only record that you have of the policy. The way they dealt with it was to have a marker card, and you had to sort of sign the receipt and then put that in. Some of the places, you've probably seen it in libraries, they would put a steel rod through all the cards so that you couldn't actually remove it. And then you would have to work it. Very time consuming. So James Rand's son, James Rand Jr., comes up with a technique called the Cardex file, which he claims speeds things up by 4 times. And what you have there is a system where the index cards are permanently held inside the filing trays, but you can sort of bring them down, open them out, write the details in, and then push it back. So you can do the whole thing without actually moving the card and taking it away. You might ask the question, how did you actually learn to use it? Because these are very complicated systems. They're as complicated in their way as trying to use modern software. Just because the technology is simple, actually using it is not particularly so. So on the left, you've got the Cardex Institute, which is an organization in New York, It's basically a training school. So if you want to use the Cardex equipment, you would send your office managers there to learn how to use the technology. Absolutely standard. The other thing they did was to produce a set of guides. So the example on the right there is for stock control. So if you wanted to organize this thing for a stock control system, then it sort of tells you the kind of things you would need to do and the cards you would need to get printed. It's interesting the way that's just how software is done today, with sort of training schools and sort of brochures describing common applications. Well, when Rand Senior comes to the end of his life and both businesses are going well, Mrs. Rand, the mother, says, why don't you two merge your businesses and sort of heal the wounds of having had these two separate businesses all this time, which they do, and it becomes Rand Cardex. You can see left here, on the left here, the whole emphasis of the firm is about data security, because just like today, if you lose business records, you really are in trouble. So what they've got here is flood, fire, pestilence, I think. And of course, what they've merged with the safe cabinet, which is a kind of where you can keep your records inside a fireproof safe and so on. The things are made of metal, non-combustible materials and so forth. A lot of attention to security. And as the firm expands, Rand Jr. Decides to acquire Remington typewriter as well. So this now becomes Remington Rand, established 1927. Just as a matter of interest, it grows very rapidly. It's the dominant firm, office machine firm in the world. If I can just give you some statistics, it has 219 branch offices in the States and 115 overseas. So it's an enormous business. And you can see just the range of equipment there, everything from adding machines and punch card machines to filing equipment. And that then becomes, is the firm that produces the first computer, Univac, and I'm going to talk about Univac in a moment. So that then really is the database story. The next story I wanted to talk about was the physical design of mainframes. And the designer of IBM mainframes was a man called Eliot Noyes, who was a leading designer in the United States. If you look at that image, it probably looks to you a bit like a computer room. In fact, it's not actually. It's a reception area in the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. But it's an architectural style that becomes very associated with computing, and to a degree still is. So in fact, the things there on the right look exactly like IBM disk files, though they're not. I don't know what they are, just somebody has obviously taken this imagery and used it. So it's what I call sort of a zeitgeist. I'm not saying that IBM, that anybody copied IBM directly, but just simply created a new mood of what a computer room should look like. I ought to say that IBM started out as a punch card accounting machine manufacturer, and it had no industrial design expertise whatsoever. So this is an example from the 1920s. Well, those machines on the right, which really could have come out of a factory, and actually look somewhat dangerous with lots of exposed moving parts, are sorting equipment. The man is sitting down there at a tabulating machine. No attempt at industrial design. Those machines actually date more or less from before the First World War. By the mid-20s, when they're producing what's called their 80-column card, they do start to do a little bit more industrial design. So what they have there is a card sorter, you can see is the most changed. It's got these horrible cabriole legs, Queen Anne. I mean, why would you put Queen Anne legs on an office machine? All you can say is they weren't alone. If you look at office machine generally of that era, you'll see a lot of Queen Anne legs. So this is IBM's, it's a postcard actually, that IBM produced for the World's Fair in 1939, and it shows their complete array of products. And if, I don't know how much you can see, but as you home in on them, you see what they are sort of grey enamel, the cabriole legs, sometimes with casters. Pretty unattractive and uninteresting sort of machinery. They would barely grace an office. Moving to the post-war era, so this is actually from 1949. So during the war, of course, IBM has been engaged on military manufacture, so it's done no research and development and had relatively little production. So in fact, these are really pictures of pre-war machines, but just happened to have been purchased in 1949. The drawing actually is done by Boris Artsebachev, his career was actually illustrating in this style for engineering companies. You've probably seen them you may have seen them in other and different contexts. But he kind of anthropomorphizes this machinery. Finally, we move into the post-war era, and IBM has engaged a designer called Norman Belgedis. I think the father, actually, of the actress. What you've now got is a sort of streamline look. If you look now, all the works inside are enclosed, and you've got this kind of round cornered look. So both of those examples kind of show that sort of chunky look. The question was, they were counters, they weren't really computers. So the question was, how should a computer look? And it's interesting that how do computers get to look the way they do? You know, it's a conscious evolutionary process. So this is the first IBM computer. It's called the Automatic Sequence Controller, usually known as the Harvard Mark I. It was built for Harvard University. There are no coloured images, incidentally, which is why I've used a black and white one. The image at the top is a concept vehicle designed by Norman Belgedis. So you can see he's sometimes called the father of American streamline, a very influential designer indeed. And IBM hired him to do the design of the Harvard Mark I. And as you can see, it's what you call a monolithic computer, so it's just this huge chunk of machinery. So that was the original vision for a computer. This is another image from 1948. IBM built another machine called the Selective Sequence Electronic Calculator, which they installed in the shop window, as it were, of their New York headquarters in Madison Avenue. The black and white image again at the top sort of shows an actual photograph of the machine. As you see, it's sort of this kind of monolithic machine, although again it is designed, but it covers three walls of a room with kind of an operating desk in the middle. I just love the illustration on the right, done by Shell, who was a user of this machine. There are many accounts of this machine, for example, in the New Yorker, the magazine. Apparently it was called Popper by passing people. It was quite a sight that you would walk past this, see this huge amount of machinery, which, you know, to a 1948 eyes looked completely like science fiction. Here's some more sort of images of what computers looked like before we sort of get very many modern manufactured computers. The one on the left is done by, or done for, the Eckert-Mauchly Computer Company. And they actually produced the Univac that is then acquired by Remington Rand, so that's the connection here. But when you look at it, you can see it's basically, again, this monolithic design. Just with a console desk and sort of just a huge chunk of material, sort of looking like a small locomotive or something. And on the right there, an illustration from the New Yorker, clearly based, I don't quite know what the joke is here, it perhaps explains elsewhere, but clearly based on the SSEC at IBM's headquarters. Well, this is Univac, who was the first to market with the machine. And again, it's sort of conspicuous, this really, for the sheer lack of design. So you've got this humongous monolithic machine, the Univac, at the back. You can just see it in that picture. And the arrangement of the machine is actually completely haphazard. There are no sort of straight lines. It almost looks as though the machinery has been dropped. And this is IBM's attempt. So this is IBM's first computer, 1953, made to compete with the Univac. And it's rather interesting because what you've got there on the right is a photograph that was taken of it. As you can see, they sort of lined it up against the walls. And obviously it's been redrawn for this advertisement on the left. And it's like a spot the difference. Can you spot the difference between these two images? If you look at the center of the picture, you'll see that on one, the door is open, showing the insides of the computer. On the other one, they've closed it. So this is a constant dilemma that whether you should show the internals of a computer, which actually are rather beautiful, or whether you should enclose all the equipment. It's what Eliot Noyes calls the parlour versus the coal cellar view of the machine. Well, on the right, that is actually Eliot Noyes who becomes the designer. The story is that the man on the left is Thomas Watson Jr., who's the son of the original president of IBM. And in 1952, he takes over from his father effectively, although his father remains chairman of the board. During the war, Thomas Watson had been in the army, and so had Eliot Noyes. And Eliot Noyes was a flying instructor, and he had taught Thomas Watson to fly, and they'd become quite good buddies. After the war, they formed sort of a friendly relationship. And Eliot Noyes sort of decided to make it his mission to educate Thomas Watson about design. So, for example, when he was on European trips, he would visit Olivetti in Italy, pick up lots of their colourful brochures, and they were masters of industrial design, give them to a friend inside IBM who would give them to Tom, so he never knew where all these came from. But gradually he sort of indoctrinated Watson. Now, IBM had decided to redesign its electromatic typewriter, which it had manufactured since 1932 without change. So the advertisement on the left, proudly 17 years of electric performance. In fact, that means it's unchanged for 17 years. So 1949, and this is a 1932 object, clearly in need of revamping. So he gives Norman Bell Geddes the commission to redesign this typewriter for the post-war world. And that's the result on the right. In fact, Bell Geddes hands the project over to Eliot Noyes, and this is the design that he comes up with. On its own, it looks rather beautiful here, actually. It's kind of nicely streamlined in pastel colours. Except, of course, if you look at all office machinery in the post-war period, they all look exactly the same, sort of 5 different pastel colours and streamlined corners. So Eliot Noyes, it wasn't an embarrassment, but he took no particular pride in it. In 1952, Norman Bell Geddes dies and the firm goes bankrupt, and Eliot Noyes takes over the firm, and it becomes Eliot Noyes Associates rather than Norman Bell Geddes Associates. So he now is actually in charge of things. I just want to show you the aftermath of the typewriter because it's rather interesting. What he then produces is what's called the Selectric typewriter. IBM has invented a new technology called the golf ball typewriter rather than the clashing bars. And I think it's Noyes' realization that actually you no longer need a moving carriage in this typewriter. You can get the golf ball to move. So he goes to the engineers and actually sort of reconfigure the design. And in a way, that's what industrial design is about. So they reconfigure it. The left actually is their design studio, and all those typewriters on the table actually are clay. as they're exploring different shapes and possibilities of what a typewriter ought to look like. And this is sort of one of the design icons, really, of the post-World War world. In fact, it actually features on an American stamp of design masterpieces. I think the KitchenAid mixer is one of the others, but it's those sort of very iconic designs. Well, let me go back then to the business of computers. The first job that Thomas Watson gives Noyes is to redesign the headquarters. You remember we saw that in the previous thing with the computer and the thing. But this is what it looks like. So that's a photograph from 1949. You can see that from the Model 407 tabulator there in the foreground. And what the point Noyes makes is that this couldn't be more inappropriate for as a location for modern office machinery. You've got this deeply coffered ceiling, marble floors, oriental rugs everywhere, wood cladding on the walls. As it says, it looks like the stateroom in the SS Queen Mary. You know, it's not a selling machine. So Thomson, slightly against his better judgment, gives Noyes a free hand, says, okay, do it your way. So he takes everything out of here, and this is actually the same room, okay, on the right. Put in a false ceiling with diffuse lighting, a white floor, and this primary coloured wall, really truly striking. The interesting thing is that Watson invites his father to come and have a look at the transformation, kind of terrified at the prospect, because I mean he had personally designed the original decor. Apparently he's quite delighted with it. So now Thomson says, well, would you like to work for us full time? He declines and says, no, I'll work for IBM. Sorry, I'll work with IBM, but not for IBM. So he spends 3/4 of his time for the next however many years actually working on an IBM brief, but also working on other things as well. And his argument is that if I become an employee, I'll never have a direct line to the board, whereas as an outsider and as a friend of you, I do. And that's how he gets these changes made. The first thing he tries to do is to brighten up this machinery with some primary colours. You see on the left. This is an example from NASA, I think, where you've got sort of yellow, blue, the old standard round cordon equipment just sprayed a different colour, and it does jazz it up a lot. But his decision afterwards is that we will never sell multicoloured equipment to people again. They can have one colour, otherwise it just looks too discordant. Another piece of industrial design is when IBM invents the disk. And the little inset in this picture, I don't know if I can move that, just there, that little inset in the bottom, shows the RAMAC computer there, and you can just see behind a glass door there, the rotating drum there. So this is how he's starting to resolve the coal cellar and parlour dilemma. So you can actually see this rather beautiful object, and it becomes... And that's a thing that's adopted actually by most computer disk manufacturers, the idea of a glass door, so you can see the pretty insides. In 1959, IBM announces the 1401 computer. It's its first transistorized computer, and it's the thing that essentially starts off the computer age. Up till 1962, IBM sells more accounting machines than computers. But when the 1401 is launched, the whole thing switches around and it becomes sort of the world's dominant computer company. And these are some design studies that Eliot Noyes does for the 1401. So you can see this general idea again of the false ceiling with diffuse lighting, a white floor, and this orthogonal arrangement so that everything is at right angles. Everything is modular and bolted together or separated by a small face, but always in a kind of a rectangular field, and a false floor so that you don't see any of the internal wiring. Here's part of the advertising campaign. One on the top is actually, you're allowed to have any one of 3 colours, which curiously are called flame red, sun yellow, or sky blue. That's so you can have one of those colours. It's interesting, in this advertisement, they've actually reproduced the machines in monochrome in order, as it were, not to force a choice on the customer. Looks rather Mondrian-like, doesn't it? And this would be pure Eliot Noyes. The bottom right is an actual installation, and most people go for blue, and it's said that that's why IBM becomes called Big Blue. I don't know if it's true or not. Just to show how much this computer look has taken over, this is an example from Britain. It's the ICT 40 series of punch card machines. And these were actually not computers, but punch card machines made starting in 1930. What you've got on the monochrome images there are two of the machines. They were photographed in 1947, those images. What you've got on the bottom there is from a product catalogue. They're actually exactly the same machines, but the one in the foreground on the right is the tabulating machine. And all they've done actually is to put these sharp-cornered, colourful cabinets on. And you see the woman standing at the sorter there. Again, exactly, the old one was sort of standing on a wooden cabinet, and this now becomes sort of a much sharper looking piece of machinery. So this computer look starts to spread quite wide, and it sort of takes over office furniture and all sorts. In 1964, IBM produces the System 360 computer, which of course, again, after 1401, kind of becomes the next major event in computing. What this is actually is not the computer, but it's a 1/10 scale model that comes from the Noyes archive. And you can see here, I mean, it's very interesting to watch the design process. It's not something we normally talk about in the history of computing, but you can see the design process going on here. That in a sense you have the white tabletop, and you sort of play with these rather like tin soldiers, sort of getting the look and feel of the thing right. Here's another image. It's from what's called the White Room. At the back of IBM's headquarters in Poughkeepsie in New York, there's actually a shed. It's 100 foot long, 50 foot wide, completely painted white, so that you can photograph the machinery as it shows here. Again, this is interesting because these aren't actually computers. They're made of plywood, sprayed, a possible colour that they would like to choose. So again, with live models to sort of photograph it. So this is all pre-publicity stuff for before the machines are actually produced. This is perhaps the most iconic picture, I think, people say, of the System 360, which is with on the left, a bullseye lens, sort of a vertical view of System 360. I actually think it's very interesting when you put it on the right there against an image from 2001, A Space Odyssey. Don't want to overstate it, but there's a kind of resonance there, is there not? And this is my last image. This is actually from just near here. It's the Banker's Automated Clearing System, called APAX, I think now. But these aren't IBM computers. They're actually ICL, but you can see the design ethos is just the same. So everything is coloured in this bright primary colour, Hot Tango, it's called. You've got the diffuse lighting from above, and the false floor, a white false floor with kind of the wiring underneath, and everything again in this kind of orthogonal arrangement. So everything is at right angles to something else, which we taught. And I call it a zeitgeist because this is how all computer rooms come to look, and it's a very persistent phenomenon. So really going back from 1959 right up to 1989 when this photograph is taken, and actually beyond that, well, as long as mainframes exist, they all tend to have this kind of characteristic look. But time's beaten me, so I'll finish there. Thank you.